All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thanks to as always, for taking the time to join us this morning. It's my sincere pleasure to welcome Dr. Rob Soofer for his talk titled U.S. Homeland Missile Defense, Room for Expanded Roles. I'm not going to say a whole lot here to tee up the topic other than if you are a frequent listener to these talks, you will know sort of what's happening in the broader security environment. You'll be aware that potential adversary missile-based threats, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, are growing in both size and sophistication. And because of these threats, there is a very active debate on what missile defenses, both regional and homeland, should be asked to do against these threats. So we're very fortunate to have with us today someone who has spent a lot of time inside the government, both in executive and legislative roles, and outside of the government, thinking about this very topic against these very types of threats. So let me say a little bit about the speaker. Dr. Soofer is a senior fellow in the forward defense practice of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, where he leads its nuclear strategy project. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Center for Security Studies, where he teaches courses in nuclear strategy, missile defense, and arms control. He's a consultant for Sandia, Los Alamos, and here at Lawrence Livermore in the national laboratories, as well as the Institute for Defense Analysis. Dr. Soofer was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Missile Defense Policy from April 2017 to January 2021, where he was my former boss. In this capacity, he was co-director of the Nuclear Posture Review and the Missile Defense Reviews and led their implementation. He testified before Congress on nuclear missile defense policy. He led biannual staff talks with key allies, and he was a representative for the NATO high-level group for nuclear planning. And he was the Secretary of Defense representative to the U.S.-Russia nuclear arms control talks, where you can rest assured the Russians raised missile defense as many times as they possibly could. So the ground rules, the speaker is going to deliver his remarks for 40 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor up for discussion. Please get your hands up electronically using the web app function. Please get your questions in the chat. Feel free to do that as soon as you have questions, and that way I can get the discussion with Dr. Soofer rolling as soon as he concludes his remarks. So Dr. Soofer, thank you again for taking the time to be with us, and over to you for your remarks.
Mike, good morning or good afternoon, and to everybody out there. Thank you so much for inviting me to come discuss this with you. I wanted to say at the outset that this is sort of the result of an issue paper that my colleague Matt Koslow and I put together at the Atlantic Council. You can find it on the website of the Atlantic Council. It's called U.S. Homeland Missile Defense, Room for Expanded Roles. I'm sorry that Matt cannot be here to join us, but he is, I think, one of the most brilliant young analysts of missile defense, and you can find lots of his work on the National Institute for Public Policy website. So having said that, Mike, you mentioned that there's a very active debate over missile defense, and that's probably an understatement. I think not since the church banned the crossbow in the Middle Ages has a weapon stirred so much passion. In fact, they said that the crossbow was believed to do the work of the devil. Sometimes I think that's the way the critics of missile defense think about missile defense even today. But all kidding aside, Bernard Brodie observed back in 1973, which was just 1 year after the ABM Treaty was signed, that, quote, the whole ABM question touched off so intense and emotional a debate in this country as to be virtually without precedent on any issue of weaponry. And so that debate continues, and you're probably asking me, hey, Rob, why are you raising this again? Why are you raising this controversial issue yet again? And I think the simple answer is that we're in a different strategic environment. There are ballistic missile threats to the homeland that are increasing, both from rogue states as well as great power rivals. And it's probably time to reconsider our current bifurcated U.S. missile defense policy. For those of you unfamiliar, we have one policy directed against regional adversaries and regional threats, which is that we will build missile defenses integrated air and missile defenses against all comers, all threats, Russia, China, as well as the rogues. But when it comes to homeland missile defense, our policy has been, both Republican and Democratic policy, really since the end of the Cold War, but certainly by the late 90s with the Missile Defense Act of 1999. Our policy has been to provide defense of the homeland only against rogue powers and to continue to rely on nuclear deterrence to deter Russian and Chinese ICBM threats to the homeland. And again, the purpose of this discussion is to get people thinking about whether it's time to move the needle on that policy and see if there are additional roles for homeland defense besides just protecting against rogue powers. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about North Korea and then Russia and China, and conclude with thoughts about taking this in different directions, further research, and then solicit your comments on where we're headed. And of course, we'll try to address some of the policy counter arguments to my proposition, and see if we can deal with those. So first, with respect to North Korea, and my first point here is even if you don't want to engage in this debate, that is, even if you don't think you want to change homeland missile defense policy to deal with the major powers, we're probably going to have no choice, because if our policy remains to stay ahead of North Korea, as North Korea expands its missile defense capabilities, we will have to expand our homeland missile defense capabilities to stay ahead of that threat. And at some point, and it'll probably come sooner rather than later, the Russians and the Chinese will complain that we're now building missile defenses that can address their nuclear retaliatory forces and not just North Korea. So we're going to have this debate one way or the other. In fact, earlier last year, Representative Seth Moulton, who is the ranking Democrat on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, during their hearing on missile defense, in his opening statement, he said, look, if we continue to expand our current arsenal of interceptors, we must ask not just how North Korea will respond, but how Russia and the Chinese Communist Party will respond as they see a pathway for our missile shield to impact their deterrent as well. He goes on to say, at what point will this arms race provoke a response from Russia and the Communist Party? So, I mean, that's his view. I don't think it's shared widely throughout members of Congress, but certainly the Republicans have a different view. And the HASC Republicans tweeted back in February that, look, it has to be the missile defense policy of the U.S. to outpace the DPRK threat to the homeland. It's clear that the 44 ground-based interceptors that we now deploy are not enough. We need to accelerate the next generation interceptors and begin moving to space-based defenses. And look, you have two choices here. You can say that we're not going to stay ahead of the North Korean threat and rely on nuclear deterrence in the same way we did during the Cold War against Russia and China, or you can again continue to try to pace the threat and stay ahead of the threat. According to the 2022 Missile Defense Review, we need to stay ahead for the following reason. I say that homeland missile defense systems, such as the ground-based mid-course defense system, offer a visible measure of protection for the U.S. population, while reassuring allies and partners that the United States will not be coerced by threats to the homeland from states like the DPRK and potentially Iran. And so, if we are going to maintain a grand strategy of seeking to create favorable balances of power in key regions that affect our security, we are going to have to rely on allies. And if we're going to rely on allies, we have to convince those allies that we're willing to run risks on their behalf. If we are not willing to defend ourselves, our own homeland, against North Korean threats, why would they think that we would defend them against North Korean threats? In this sense, I think that competing with North Korea in this area, that is homeland missile defense, reducing our vulnerability, enhances the credibility of the extended deterrence guarantee. And we know that our allies are starting to get nervous. In fact, back in November of 2022, Japan's defense minister publicly noted the increasing vulnerability of the United States to North Korean missiles after a recent North Korean missile, which the Japanese defense minister said could now reach all of the United States. I can't remember the last time a foreign official essentially pointed out the vulnerability of the United States to the North Korean threat. And of course, South Korea is contemplating its own nuclear arsenal. Public opinion polls are calling for deployment of their own capability. And I think, again, this is a result of their lack of confidence, potentially, in the US nuclear umbrella brought about by the increasing vulnerability of the United States to North Korean threats. And so my argument is a simple one, that by reducing the vulnerability of the United States to those threats, we regain the trust and confidence of our allies. And so our recommendation here is clear. Let's continue to pace the threat. And what this means in the near term is we're going to continue to have this comprehensive missile defense and missile defeat approach to the problem. And that is, we don't just rely on an active missile defense to shoot down the missiles once they're in the air, but we want to find those missiles prior to launch and eliminate them on the launch pad. With respect to the active missile defense, I think we have to anticipate increasing the size of our NGI force, the next generation or ground-based interceptor force, to at least 100 to stay ahead of the North Korean threat. Now, I would defy anybody out there to show me an official U.S. government estimate of how many ICBMs North Korea deploys. I haven't seen it. The best we can do is acknowledge the fact that we saw 11 of them on parade in North Korea. But other than that, we don't know for sure how many ICBMs they have, nor how quickly will the threat expand. But we do know that they will expand, and they're going to get to the point sooner rather than later where they can overcome the 44 interceptors we have deployed today. The plan right now is to add another 20 next generation interceptors beginning in 2028, but that'll take us to 64, and that's clearly not going to be enough. And as we start to contemplate expanding the numbers, again, this is going to engender as Mike would say, a very active debate, shall we say. But I want to remind people, and it's interesting to keep this in mind, that while we're arguing over 44 or 64 interceptors, it was the plan of the Clinton administration in the late 90s to actually begin deployment by 2003 of a ground-based national missile defense system that would comprise 100 interceptors. That was supposedly the first phase. The second phase would take this up to 200 interceptors, again, to deal with the North Korean and potentially the Iranian threat. And the hope was that they could amend the ABM treaty in order to keep that framework in place, but allow us to deploy up to 200 interceptors. And the number 200 is interesting because that's how many interceptors were originally allowed by the ABM treaty. The other thing that we can do in the near term to address the North Korean threat is provide an underlayer. An underlayer means using existing regional missile defense capabilities such as THAAD and maybe the Standard Missile 3, which is our sea-based missile defense interceptor, to serve as an underlayer to the ground-based mid-course defense system. Back in 2020, we conducted a test of the SM-3 Block 2A missile against a North Korean representative ICBM, and the test was a success. The Trump administration had planned to integrate the SM-3 2A missile into the complete command and control system of the ground-based mid-course defense system, as well as upgrade the missile and buy more of them. And the concept would be you can either put them on ships located off the coast, or you could actually deploy these on land as well. That particular program, the underlayer program, was eliminated by the Biden administration. But we do have an emergency capability today. That is, we have ships located in San Diego or other ports on the West Coast that could be sent to sea with the SM-3 2A missile and positioned in a location that would have a shot against a North Korean ICBM headed to, let's say, the western coast. So we have that capability, but we don't have enough missiles, and we can certainly expand the inventory in the near term. So that's the North Korean part of this problem. Now, the more interesting part of this problem set is Russia and China, and we address this in two respects. One is sort of limited coercive attacks against the United States or threats from Russia and China, and then later I'll talk about defending the United States, or at least our retaliatory forces, against a large-scale Russian or Chinese attack in the context of this emerging nuclear problem. But let's first talk about limited threats to the homeland. And there are two aspects of this particular threat. One is Russia and China could employ nuclear or cruise missiles in a limited manner against the United States homeland to paralyze U.S. opposition to their regional military campaign, or to get us to back down. The limited size of the attack is meant to coerce the United States, but not to shock it into an unlimited nuclear response. The second aspect of this problem is Russia and China might use conventional cruise or ballistic missiles against critical U.S. infrastructure to break our will to fight, or to deter similar U.S. conventional strikes against their territory. This is a problem that was identified recently by the congressionally mandated Strategic Posture Commission. They say, given the threat picture for 2027 to 2035, the currently planned U.S. Homeland integrated air and missile defense capability does not adequately defend against coercive attacks from China and Russia. Such attacks are potentially designed to dissuade and deter the United States from defending or supporting its allies and partners in a regional conflict. And then they define a coercive attack as a coercive attack consists of limited conventional or nuclear strikes intended to convince U.S. leadership that the costs of intervening or persevering in a conflict involving the attacker are too high. The coercive effect of the attack is based on the threat that additional attacks will follow if the U.S. refuses to be coerced. So even before the Posture Commission weighed in, we were hearing from defense officials that this was a potential problem. The former NORTHCOM commander, General Van Herk, testified back in March, quote, "Over the last year, our competitors have accelerated their fielding of kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities to specifically designed to threaten our homeland." And he goes on to talk about the potential risks to critical infrastructure such as military bases, ports of embarkation. He goes on to talk about critical command and control nodes, as well as U.S. nuclear forces. Army Secretary Christine Wormuth goes even further than Van Herk. I think she says, if we got into a major war with China, the United States homeland would be at risk as well, with both kinetic attacks and non-kinetic attacks. They are going to go after the will of the United States public. They are going to try to erode support for a conflict. And so our argument here is that while deterrence of these threats through the threat of retaliation remains a centerpiece in U.S. defense strategy, deterrence through the threat of punishment works best when it's complemented with the ability to deny the adversary its objectives in the first place. And the goal here is not to protect all of the United States against a Chinese or Russian missile attack, whether conventional or nuclear, but rather to deny these adversaries confidence in their ability to coerce the United States through these limited conventional or nuclear threats. So we just need to deploy enough against the right targets or the right assets to complicate Russian and Chinese attack plans. And if designed correctly, the attacker would not be certain which critical U.S. assets are protected and to what extent. And again, this would so complicate their attack that they would hopefully abandon any efforts of trying to launch limited strikes against the United States with the purpose of blackmailing us. If we think that this policy makes sense, then we have to begin a sort of a national level technical military study on what technology is available and the various concepts for protecting critical infrastructure. In fact, U.S. Northern Command has a concept in mind for expanded cruise missile defense of the homeland, which begins with deploying more sensors so that we can see the threat earlier and quicker. So now to the second aspect of the Russia-China problem set, and that is we're all trying to grapple with the implications of China's expansion and the notion that we are going to have to now deter two nuclear major powers at the same time. And the question now becomes, as China begins to expand, do we have enough nuclear forces to address the problem? And addressing the problem, put simply, is you can either expand the size of U.S. nuclear weapons to address the problem, you can make the current U.S. nuclear forces more survivable, or some combination of the two. So if you are concerned that Russia and or China could launch an attack against U.S. nuclear forces or command and control in an attempt to decapitate us or to disarm us, to the extent that you can make U.S. nuclear forces more survivable, you can again deter that threat. And the concept here would be one of preferential missile defense. Preferential missile defense means that we would intercept only those warheads that appear to be targeted against U.S. nuclear forces or other strategic assets. You could do this through exo-atmospheric intercepts, that is, intercepting things outside the atmosphere, as our ground-based interceptors do today. Or you can try to intercept those missiles inside the atmosphere using things such as potentially THAAD or the SM-3 missile. One of the advantages of intercepting missiles in the terminal stage is the warheads come through the atmosphere, and any decoys or countermeasures are burned up, making the task of the defense easier in that sense, because now it doesn't have to deal with multiple objects. But again, I want to emphasize the purpose here is not a comprehensive protection for the United States homeland. We are not at the end of the day going to reduce our vulnerability to a dedicated Russian and Chinese attack against U.S. society. So in this sense, we're not going to be mitigating or eliminating Russia and China's assured second strike capability. What we are going to be doing is creating enough uncertainty in the mind of the Russian and Chinese attack planner that they could not contemplate an attack against U.S. strategic nuclear forces. And again, with the two nuclear pair problem, this gets a little more complicated because potentially you're fighting a major nuclear war against one, and you need to preserve enough forces and to be able to communicate with those forces so that you could fight a second major nuclear war if it came to that. And having that capability, again, deters such a situation at the outset. So what you would do is you would build preferential defenses to protect ICBM fields. Maybe if we go to a mobile ICBM as well, you'd protect air bases, or nuclear submarine bases, nuclear command and control nodes. And again, this would not require, I don't think, a huge deployment, but just enough to complicate the adversary's attack planning. We looked at preferential defense in the 1980s when we were trying to figure out how to make the MX missile more survivable, and there are some concepts even today. In the report that I referenced, we have a graphic there that was provided by the Lockheed Martin company, where they show, based on their analysis, that there is some inherent capability in the THAAD missile to protect very small areas against ICBMs. Perhaps suitable for protecting ICBM silos, for example. So the bottom line is, if we are going to move towards defenses against Russia and China, again, these limited defenses, or I should say defenses against limited attacks, the defenses will probably have to be more capable than they are today, because Russian and Chinese missiles are more capable than the North Korean counterparts. But again, I think the object is not to protect the entire United States, but rather to enhance deterrence by complicating the attacker's plans. So having said that, what are some of the potential arguments? And I think you can probably anticipate most of them. The first one has to do with sort of arms racing stability. And the concern is that if we were to deploy even these limited defenses against Russia and China, this would provoke an offensive buildup by the other side, and you would have this traditional action-reaction arms race phenomena. Or at the very least, it would preclude a follow-on agreement to the New START agreement because missile defense would be such an impediment. Well, look, this would take a long time to address, but I think that there's enough evidence to support the notion that the action-reaction theory may not be totally viable. In this, I'll give you one example. After we signed the ABM Treaty, which implied that if you limited your defenses, there would be no reason for the adversary to build more offenses. Well, it turned out that nuclear forces in both the U.S. arsenal as well as the Soviet arsenal increased. In fact, according to a CRS report, nuclear weapons grew from about Soviet strategic weapons grew from about 2,500 in 1972 to more than 10,000 by the late 1980s. So this notion that if you limit defenses, you would be able to limit offenses is probably more complicated than the theory would suggest. By the same token, when we withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002, we actually managed to reduce the number of Russian and U.S. nuclear weapons, leading ultimately to the New START Treaty limits of 1,550. So clearly, I think that arms control and missile defense could be made compatible, but it's certainly worth a discussion, and it will be a discussion with the Russians. But I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. The other typical argument, and this was one that was made more during the Cold War than today, and that is that if the United States has missile defenses during a crisis, there would be more. It would be more likely that one side or the other would launch a preemptive strike against the other. The notion would be that if the United States had missile defenses, they could launch a disarming first strike against Russia or China and then be able to absorb their ragged retaliation. Likewise, if Russia or China felt that the United States had an advantage in missile defenses, they might strike first, thinking that by going first, at least they'd be able to destroy more of U.S. capability and more of U.S. society than if they had waited to go second. This was a more or less, I think, an academic argument. It had policy implications during the Cold War, but it grew out of a period where U.S. and Soviet nuclear forces were potentially vulnerable to a surprise attack, especially when we deployed only bombers and not missiles. But we are at a period today where, by DoD's own admission, Russia and even China are growing the survivability of their nuclear forces. China is moving to a launch on warning posture. During a crisis situation, clearly Russian and Chinese, as well as American nuclear forces, would all be on alert. And so the notion that you would have some advantage by going first today just I don't think is realistic. And the notion that an American president would launch a first strike, a disarming first strike, which, by the way, is not U.S. policy, not U.S. stated policy, but the notion that the president would launch a nuclear first strike and then rely on what's clearly going to be not a foolproof missile defense system to absorb the retaliation, I just don't think that is realistic either. Of course, you have to convince the Chinese and the Russians of this notion as well. But the last thing I'm going to say with respect to all of these arguments, and especially the Russian and Chinese criticisms of U.S. missile defense, is that you have to remember that Russia and China are building their own missile defense capabilities, right? They understand the value of not only regional missile defense, but especially homeland missile defense. So at the very least, there are, this sort of belies their criticism of U.S. missile defense as being destabilizing. And the worst scenario would be if they were to build out their homeland missile defenses while the U.S. does not, then potentially in a crisis situation, China or Russia may feel that because they are better protected against both limited and large-scale U.S. attacks, uh, that they would have an advantage during that particular crisis. It's difficult, I think, to find a good research on what Russia and China are doing. We do know that, according to official DoD reports, that Moscow is upgrading its current national missile defense system, which comprises about 68 nuclear-tipped missiles, which protects the Moscow area, including some co-located ICBM fields. And China, too, is working on these capabilities. It's reported in the recent China military power report that China is working on mid-course defense systems. And I just stumbled upon a report by a young scholar at Carnegie. His name is Tong Zhao, Z-H-A-O, who has written a report on missile defense and Chinese views. And he actually goes into primary sources, Chinese primary sources, and concludes that, quote, the mainstream view appears to be that China should conduct comprehensive research and development on all types of missile defense technologies, including technologies to defend against hypersonic weapons, and focus on the deployment of multi-layered but limited missile defense capabilities over key areas in the near term. Examples of key areas to be protected likely include the capital city and important military facilities such as command and control centers and strategic missile fields. So even China is thinking along those lines. More analysis needs to be done on the implications of Russia, the United States, and China all deploying homeland missile defenses. But I think what strikes me the most is with missile defenses deployed by all three powers, the prospect of launching a disarming first strike against any other is dramatically reduced. Because again, the complication that would be presented by a missile defense capability would make it really difficult for any attack planner, whether it's Russian, American, or Chinese, to contemplate a successful disarming first strike against the other. So I want to end here because I'm really interested in your responses to whether you think we need to expand the role of U.S. Homeland Defense to address these Russian and Chinese threats, whether you think the counter arguments to doing so deserve merit. But the next step in this project is going to be for us to talk more specifically with U.S. Northcom, U.S. Stratcom, to think about or to understand how they think about this problem, and then approach U.S. defense industry to see if there are some new technologies, some new ways of getting at this problem that perhaps the U.S. government hasn't thought about. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions, your discussions, and certainly your comments. Thank you.